Another in the line of compass designs that there's such a surfeit of game ideas that they come out with that I really, really want to get a hold of. This one's Europe in Turmoil. It's basically inspired by Twilight Struggle, which now is no longer easy to see because I had kind of a mold problem and I haven't resolved how I want to cope with it. Yeah. But set in a period the compass seems to really be going all out on, which is that World War I period. This is the prelude to World War I. The only game that I have that's a prelude to World War I that I can think of is Pax Britannica. I mean, you could say Lords of Sierra Madre, but not really. Pax Britannica is really the serious prelude to World War I. And it handles the colonialism aspect, positively or negatively. I mean, I love the game, but it's got its flaws. This one's going to handle more of the political atmosphere inside Europe. Now, there's also Origins of World War I, which I haven't gotten around to playing. I keep trying to convince myself to make a little print and play copy of it, because I kind of like Origins of World War II, and I think a World War I based one is actually probably more interesting. Unlike those two games, though, this is a two-player game. And right off the bat, there's kind of a question about, hey, what's up with a two-player game about, you know, this sort of breakdown of the concert of Europe and all of that? Well, that's an interesting question. The way the designer has chosen to take it is to take it as an ideological conflict, where the players aren't necessarily associated with a given nationality. Rather, they're exerting the ideological forces that were in play, at least in continental Europe. Okay, that's interesting. It makes it a little harder for me to kind of get into it. It's not like, you know, in Twilight Struggle, for example, which this is very, very derivative of. In Twilight Struggle, you have a fairly clear bipolar world in which, even though there are actions that maybe aren't completely controlled by, you know, it's hard to express that, yes, the U.S. would be able to make this happen. You know, you feel maybe a random events chart or something would do more. There's kind of a sensible nature to that U.S. versus Soviet conflict, along with all of the allies that are present. China's the only real wild card in it, and they give it its own due. For this, though, you don't have that kind of center of ideology that's nationalized. You could say Great Britain is sort of liberal, but they really weren't the most liberal bent along things. And they also weren't the most active in terms of promoting anything in Europe. Their main thing was to achieve sort of a status quo type situation, which has always kind of been the British goal. From the point where they started getting an empire, they started worrying about, well, we don't want to lose what we got. And other powers, you know, you could definitely look at, well, clearly Tsarist Russia and Austria-Hungary were very, very reactionary and authoritarian, but it's conceivable that things might have moved a little differently. There were plots in both countries. Likewise, Germany, Imperial Germany, was very authoritarian in and of itself, but there certainly was a strong liberalist movement there, and France was chaos. France could have fallen either way very easily. I mean, there's, you know, in the early part of, well, up until his fall, you've got Napoleon III there. So that influence is still present in addition to the Democratic Republic. Okay. Let's take a look at what we have. Like in Twilight Struggle, you have a bunch of political markers or control markers or whatever, and these are going to indicate the number of points that you put into an area into a box in order to gain, some sort of dominance over it. And there's a control value here. And if you exceed the other player by that control value, you're able to flip your marker to an established side that kind of says, yeah, this is, I really own this area, which causes, it has some effects in the rules. You also have these little markers, which are described down here. I don't know much effect that they have, but they may have effect. They very well likely have effects on the cards that you have. Speaking of the cards, you have 3 decks of cards, of these stability cards, broken into different eras, and they get shuffled in as time passes on. You start off with the Victorians, go to the Edwardians, and then go to Georgian. Now, there's a couple of different kinds of cards. Like in Twilight Struggle, you have a card that's associated with the Liberals with the blue star on it. And that's going to play very much like in Twilight Struggle, which is you have the option, if you are the Liberals, you can play this either for the point or for the event. If you're the Conservatives, you can only play it for the point, and if you do, you trigger the event. You have one other option. You can shoot it into space. No. You have the naval race, which works similar to the space race, but I don't fully understand. There are significant differences in it. We'll be looking at the rules again. I'll be going through the rules with you. So if you care to follow on that part of the journey, that's fine. I'm sure somebody else has covered this as well. It seems to have gotten some buzz given by the number of rules questions it has, which I have to question. I don't think the rules themselves are that painful, but I suspect that the cards have generated a lot of the questions, which would mean that they're either not as carefully considered as, say, Twilight Struggle's cards, not as carefully worded, or it may also indicate something having to do with just the level of competitive desire for this type of game, which, makes it really, really important that you get the cards right. Well, of course, I don't care too much about that. So that's one type of card, and some of them, and obviously here's the other kind, some of them will have a circle on them, which means that either side can play them for the event, and there's no penalty for playing it for the points. You also have scoring cards, which indicate a region on the board, a colored region like Germany, and will cause victory points to be caused for that, to be spent for that. And again, that's similar to the Twilight Struggle model. There. Now, what else do you have? You have these cards here, stability actions. At certain points in the game, you're going to be called upon to each play one of these, making a choice. And again, I don't really understand this. I read the rules a few days ago, and it's kind of passed me by. I was ill while I was reading it. So I'm hoping we can get through it a little more. I was thinking about playing this, a little bit solitaire first, but I did that with Falling Sky, and it definitely helped me. But I feel like if I don't need that to get the game to the table and start playing it, I'm not going to do that. And I know that's kind of disrespectful of you guys, but there's only so many plays I can get out of. There's only so much time I can devote to any given game at any time, and whether or not it's videoed, it doesn't really matter to me. That's just something I do. So you'll get to see the exploration of the game more fully than maybe you did with Falling Sky. There's one more deck, this Mobilization deck, and again, I don't know what it does precisely, but it's an optional rule for the end game, and I'll probably be playing that. You have some tracks and things up here, just turns and number of cards played. This determines who's going to be in the different powers. Now, this is important in the different Great War sides. This is kind of interesting because, again, if you look at the participants in World War I, you had the liberal democracies, France and Britain, but you had probably the most autocratic power of all, the Russians, on their same side. So the war does not necessarily align along these ideological bases, but the war ends up affecting the final scoring of how the ideologies are going to come out, which is kind of an interesting thing. You're not necessarily seeking to win World War I as any given side, although there may be reasons for that. And it's always going to be a France versus Germany war, which is kind of interesting because I think at least one point during this period, there was a rapprochement between France and Germany, where there was some thought that France and Germany versus England might be the way the world aligned, not necessarily involved in a war, but that, you know, things were more open. This was part of, I think, the Bismarckian balancing act and play, but it could have actually ended up early on. You have a few tracks here. Great War Status track, which is going to affect how likely the war is to start, as is the tension track, and place to keep a bunch of markers. And not all of them seem to be useful like these two. Well, this one seems to be a proof of purchase type thing, but this dude, I don't think he has an effect either. There's a compendium of all the markers here. I haven't really read through them because I like to be surprised. Naval Arms track, which gives the effects as you push forward down that. Interesting thing about that is that the Germans can't start off the naval race. It has to be the British with the Dreadnought class. Anytime before the Dreadnought was created, British superiority was just too great. And it's the creation of the Dreadnought which actually triggers a race that Britain most definitely did not want. It's a little weird because conceivably, if the Brits actually held off on creating the Dreadnought, somebody might have done it eventually. Victory points, which, as in Twilight Struggle, if you can push it past the end of the track or to the end of the track, I'm not sure which, we'll see, you get an automatic victory. Otherwise, whoever has it the furthest on their side of the track wins the game. And I think that's about it for the real basic stuff. Okay. Let's dive into the rules. And the rules as they are don't appear all that complicated, although there are some things that aren't directly from Twilight Struggle and some things, and I'm not familiar with about 1989, which had a similar lineage, although there were aspects of that kept me from buying it, mainly having to do with probably something like these stability cards where you had to fight the other player by making choices. And I just didn't like that, and I really didn't realize this had that, but how can I resist a World War I game, you know? Okay. Oh, and you have connections between spaces. Now, one of the things about the spaces that's kind of interest is that you have spaces that are geographical, but then you have things like the French Catholic Church that are more of a social thing than anything else, and the military, you know, and writers. And these are all present to indicate that this is more of an ideological battle than just a purely regional political one. Okay. Battleground spaces have a blue-yellow stripe along the top. What does that mean? Well, battleground spaces are going to be worth more during scoring rounds. And they're worth more in a couple of different ways. So they will be the places that you're more interested in taking. We talked about the items. We haven't talked about the stability cards, but there's not really much of a description there. Mobilization cards, again, we haven't talked about them yet. The markers. There's something here that says, hey, you can use these things instead of some of the markers. I don't quite understand that. We'll see how that works. There's a lot I don't understand here. Which is the time for you to say, okay, maybe I should look at my rules introduction somewhere else. Good idea. I'm doing this mainly for me, but if you happen to be watching along, that's great. Same as why I play. Okay, so each player's going to get a hand of 8 cards, which they can look at before they set up for the game. And then there's some fixed spaces that people get points. So like the authoritarian gets 4 in the French Catholic Church, 1 in the French. But after that, each player takes turns placing some additional points on the board, which they're allowed to put in any spaces that don't have the opponent's points at the time of placement. And okay, also at the beginning of the game, if you happen to have 2 or more scoring cards, you can reveal 2 of them, and then you get an extra support point in each of these 3 setups that you get to place them. Okay. And what is the authoritarian? Yeah, so the authoritarian's always placed first. British and German navies are put in the pre-dreadnought. Okay. So the base way the game is played is, I don't think there's anything like a headline event. Players get their cards. Each player is going to get 7 action rounds. And then starting on turn 4, they get 8. There's room for 9 on the thing, and you have 9 cards, so I'm not sure what's up with that. Ordinarily, you'll have an extra card left. If for any reasons you have no cards at the start of an action round, you have to forfeit that action round. They're cards that make the other person discard cards. And then if you're holding a card at the end of the turn, it can't be a scoring card. If you show a scoring card, you just lost the game. And then you check to see if the war started. And if it did, then we go to the final game part of it. The turn marker moves forward. As you break into new eras, you shuffle more cards into the deck. And then at the end of turn 10, if the game hasn't ended, you do a final scoring at that point. A special note here that Norway and Sweden are the same country at the beginning of the game. You can't place anything into Norway until that event comes up that splits them. Okay. Scoring cards have their own special rules to being played. The other cards, like I said, you can play them as operations or events. And you'll usually have 1 card at the end of your turn. You must always play. You can't just discard a card or pass. And like I said, if you play a card that's associated with your opponent, they get the chance, if they wish to, they can fire the event off. If the event has an asterisk on it, no matter what, it is played once and then removed from the game if you play it for the event. And that includes if your opponent is playing it for the event when you play your card. The phasing player gets to decide, however, whether or not he wants to allow the enemy's event to take place before or after he places he uses any of the points that he has. If the event can't happen because the prerequisite card hasn't been played, the event doesn't occur and it's returned to the discard pile. But if the card triggers the event, but the event has been prohibited, which feels very similar by a superseding event card, then the event does not occur and the card remains in play for operations only. If the card play triggers an opponent's event, it sounds like the same situation. If the card play triggers an opponent's event, but the event results in no effect, the event is still played and would be removed if it has an asterisk. If the card is played as an event requires the player discard of another card, a higher valued card can always satisfy that requirement. When you have to discard a card, The event on the discarded card will not be implemented in any way. That includes scoring cards, so you can throw them away, which is the danger to making someone discard a card. Okay. I'm going to take a look. Okay, if the camera dies. Okay. So, in this game, and I seem to remember there were multiple options in Twilight Struggle. It's been a long time since I played it. I meant to look it up. I did open it up and look at a couple of things for whatever reason, but I haven't played it since the last time I videoed it. Okay. The only thing that you're allowed to do is to play support points. And you can, if they're placed by events, you can place them anywhere. However, if their normal placement is one at a time, however, they can only be placed with or adjacent to friendly support point counters. And it costs 1 op to place one in a space that's friendly controlled or uncontrolled, but it costs 2 to invade an enemy controlled space. If the control status changes while you're placing them, this is all Twilight Struggle, you can now place them at the cheaper cost. Okay, and that's all you can do, I guess. Maybe I'm wrong. Because yeah. Okay, it explains this somewhere else. Yeah, you can play them for these support checks too. But it says you can play them in 2 ways. As operations, C6.0, which is this. Okay, so you have to use all of the operations points on either support points, support checks, or a naval arms race. If you use it to reduce an opponent's support in, this is the support check, in a country, and possibly add friendly support if the support check is successful enough. Each strategy card played for support checks gives you 2 support checks, regardless of the operations value of it. Hey, there's a use for the 1-point cards. Support checks made using operations must be done in different spaces, but this doesn't apply to those made through events. To attempt a support check in a space, the space must have at least 1 opponent SP, support point. The player must resolve the first support check before declaring the next. To resolve it, you multiply the stability number of the target space, that's the value on the space, by 2. You roll a die, you add the ops value of the card that you played to the die roll. Okay, so the 1-point cards aren't so hot. You also add 1 for each adjacent friendly controlled space, counting the UK and Egypt as liberal controlled and the Ottoman Empire as authoritarian. They always count. -1 for each adjacent opponent controlled space, same rules. And the SPs in the target space itself do not modify the die roll in any way. If you roll greater than the doubled stability number, the support check succeeds, and the phasing player removes opposing SPs equal to the difference from the target space. If there are insufficient opposing SPs to remove, he adds friendly SPs to make up the difference, but only up to control. You can't go further than control. Okay. Naval Arms Race. This contains the Naval Markers. These are initially in pre-dreadnoughts. Ops points can be spent to attempt to advance a player's marker to the next box. To do so, you roll a die and add the operations value of the card to the total. +1, if you're playing a card that's your own event. +1 if this is the second or subsequent attempt to advance to the box. And if you failed once, you flip it over and you've got a little +1 on there. Not very easy to see, but this is one of those games where the counters, and I shouldn't complain because AWE definitely does this. There are counters like this that are, you know, there's a compendium of them here, but they're very non-obvious what they're going to mean, and they don't say what they mean on them or anything bold like that. It's just a visual cue that you use. Now, that's great for the Norway flag, but many of these are just very difficult to observe. That's a problem Compass has in general. I feel like their graphic design is not up to the same level of trying to present the games clearly as most of the modern companies. I don't know, Clash of Arms has its issues too, and obviously I love AWE, and they are terrible about it at times. Okay. And +1 if the Liberal player has Admiral Fisher in effect. Okay, if the total matches or exceeds the number required to advance to the next box, which is printed in the box, you move your Navy marker forward to the next box. Unless the authoritarian player is trying to do this for no good reason, well, to get rid of a card, and the British Navy has not left the pre-dreadnought space, and it flips back from its +1 side. Otherwise, if you failed, you go over to the +1 side, and you'll get the modifier later. If the event removes a Navy marker, it remains. If it moves a Navy marker, it remains on its current side. Oh, if an event does it. A player can only make one regular naval arms race attempt per turn, although he can be allowed additional attempts due to the Helgoland class space on the naval arms track, a couple of strategy cards, a stability card. If a player has to make multiple consecutive attempts, this is across turns if not enough action rounds remain in the turn. However, attempts made by the 2-power standard do count against the limit for the purpose of deciding if a subsequent attempt may be made. Yeah. You won't be able to make... so if you have to do a mandatory attempt at the beginning of the next turn, you won't get another option to make an attempt, so it may be a bad time to do it. Yeah, I don't know. There are cards that allow you to advance it forward, which can be played for an event without affecting the naval arms race. I don't know how we're going to mark who's played a naval arms race card. That's not a problem if you're playing normally, but for me, because I walk away, might be an issue. But I don't know. You know, Twilight Struggle is fairly fast playing, so I can usually get a turn done in one sitting. When a player's naval marker advances to the next box on the arms race track, the player follows the instructions that are listed for that class of ship they just added. Okay. Regardless of the text in the card, the event of a card played as naval arms race is not implemented. The card goes into the discard pile. You shoot it into the sea. If a Navy marker reaches the final box on the naval arms track, that player can no longer make arms race attempts, which makes sense, but, you know, there's additional advantages to those attempts. Certain strategy cards can move the German Navy marker back. If this occurs and the German Navy high water mark is not yet on the board, you put it in that space just to indicate that they've gone higher. And if you reach that space again, it goes away. Then we got some other words here. It looks like it's just an example. Okay. The ops reduction or increase from strategy cards, such as absolutism, happens before any ops reduction from spaces on the naval arms track. Okay. Great. If a card has an event, you play it. Some events have an underline on them, and they remain in play until they're canceled or the end of the game. And we use their markers to indicate what their effect is. Subcards modify the operations value of cards that follow. These modifiers should be applied in aggregate. Regardless of modifiers, a non-scoring card always has a minimum ops value of 1. Events modifying the operations value of a card only apply to one player and do so for all purposes. If an event specifies that a player may conduct operations, place support, or make a support checks, as if he played a card of a certain operations value, those additional operations are treated as if the card had been played for ops points, rather than as an event, which allows you to more freedom. If an event becomes unplayable, the event card can still be used for its operations value. Okay, the tension track. The tension track is the willingness of all countries to go to war. It begins the game at a minimum of 0, and they say mark it this way. I kind of like this way better. I don't know. I don't know why they're using an arrow for this and not for anything else, but whatever. The tension can never go below 0, nor may it go higher than 6. Higher than 3 if Franz Ferdinand is in effect, and both Vienna and Budapest are under authoritarian control. Okay, I assume that's on the Franz Ferdinand card. Whenever a card effect would make it go below 0 or higher than 6, the player whose event altered the tension instead gains or loses a victory point per unresolved point of tension. May go below 0 or higher. Okay. So removing tension is good for you in those cases. The Great War Status Track. This measures the different alliances formed during this period, which will eventually cause the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and the local conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia to escalate into World War I. Why that flashpoint? I got the feeling the game said that that doesn't have to be the flashpoint, so during the designer's notes. At the beginning of the game, the 3 Emperor League marker is in the Great War Status track. Place it on the leftmost space of the track. The 3 Emperors. I see the Triple Alliance. 3 Emperors. +2. Is it these 3? No. It's these 3. There we go. Okay. Great. I didn't see that in the setup. Whenever a new marker is placed on the Great War track, place it in the leftmost open position. It is the Great War Status Modifier is the number in the leftmost open position of the Great War track. If all spaces are filled, it's a 0. Potentially modified by -2 if the 3 Emperor League marker has not been flipped to its Franco-Russian alliance side, which is on the other side. Both say +2, though. I think. Or by +1 if the Balkan War marker has been placed on the track. Yeah, okay. Whatever. See, there's a -2 here, a +2 up there. Who knows? I'm sure they mean something, but they're not described in the images of pieces. I might say it here, if I can read this. -2 to crisis rolls and +2 to war resolution for the authoritarians. Okay. Whenever a player is instructed to make a crisis roll, they do the following prior to executing the remainder of the event and/or ops expenditure. Always execute the text prior to the crisis roll instruction before making the crisis roll. You roll a die with +1 for each point of tension, and times X for the total Great War Status Modifier, which will usually, or no, +X, which will usually be a negative number. It might be 0. If the result is higher than 6, the Great War breaks out immediately and end the action phase. Skip the verify held cards phase and go to the Great War phase. Otherwise, continue the execution of the event and the game progresses. At the end of each scoring card, you make a crisis roll as well. The Great War. The Great War will always be a conflict between two sides, the Entente and the Central Powers. If decisions need to be taken for either of these sides, they are taken respectively by the liberal and authoritarians. Determine the participants. And this is summed up here. Germany's always in the Central Powers. France is always on the Entente. Britain belongs to the Entente if the Entente Cordial or the Schlieffen Plan adopted is in effect, and belongs to neither side if splendid isolation is in effect. And I assume there can't be splendid isolation in one of the others. Austria-Hungary belongs to the Central Powers if the Three Emperor League or dual alliance is in effect. Russia belongs to the Central Powers if the Three Emperor League is in effect, to the Entente if Franco-Russian alliance is in effect, and neither side if Russian collapse is in effect. The Balkans belong to the same side as the Russian Entente if Russia does not belong to either side. I'm sorry, the Balkans belong to the same side as Russia, Entente if Russia is not on either side, if the Balkan Wars or Balkan Civil War is in effect. Let's try reading this without the parenthetical. The Balkans belong to the same side as Russia if the wars or civil war is in effect. Okay. And it goes to the Entente if one of those is in effect. Having trouble parsing for some reason. It's not a good day. Okay, war resolution. The winner of the Great War is resolved. Now, this is not the winner of the game. This is going to affect the placement of pieces and therefore affect the score in the game, though. You determine each player's war resolution modifier. This is done by checking the markers on the Great War status track and any marker on the 4 event spaces above the track. Up here. Markers with black circles on the upper left corner contain a number which is a war resolution modifier for either the authoritarian if it's yellow or the liberals if it's blue. Yeah, I'm not sure I can read these. Yeah, so this is really hard. Here's a blue number. Here's a yellow number. And I really don't know. I mean, I can barely see them. And this camera is not as good as my other one at being able to see stuff, as shown by other factors. So I don't know if you can see it at all. Okay. Each player calculates their war resolution modifier. Authoritarian sums the yellow numbers, liberal sums the blue. They each roll a die, adding their modifier, +1 if they're ahead on the naval arms race, and +1 if they control either Constantinople and or Italy spaces. I guess if each side controls one of those, it nets out even, essentially. Both get +1. And if one side controls both, it's just +1. The high roller wins the Great War and gets 4 victory points. In the case of a tie, both players are now the loser of the Great War. If the Entente lost the Great War, you follow the following procedure for each scoring region belonging to either of the participating side. If the scoring region belonged to the Entente, and I'm not sure what that means. Well, France would be part of the Entente. Yeah, okay. If it was their national territory. The liberal player rolls a d6 and removes SPs from the space in the scoring region equal to the result. Subsequently, the authoritarian and then the liberal player repeat once. So they're both going to be removing pieces from that space, from that area. If the scoring region belonged to the Central Powers, though, the authoritarian rolls a d6 and gains that many ops to place SPs, or in independent spaces adjacent to the scoring region. Independent, so like Switzerland is an independent space next to both, Austria, Russia, Austria, Germany, and France. Yeah. Okay. Subsequently, the liberal player rolls a d6 and then removes SPs from the pieces in the scoring region. So here's the thing. If a nationality loses the Great War, both sides are going to lose pieces from it. If a nationality wins the Great War, the side that's aligned with their victory, now Germany could be liberal, but the side that's aligned with their victory gains ops in it, whereas the other side will lose ops in it. So Germany will tend towards authoritarianism if they win the war. And my battery's running down. Place enough support in Constantinople and Italy to give authoritarian control to both of them. If the Central Powers loses the Great War, it's a little different. You execute the procedure, the scoring region belonged to the Central Powers, the authoritarian loses a d6, then the liberals, and then the authoritarians again lose. If it belonged to the Entente, the liberal player rolls a d6, gains that many ops, then the did I read this wrong? Subsequently, the liberal player rolls a d6 and then removes SPs from spaces in the scoring region equal to that result. Whoa. So the liberal gains and then loses. What the fuck? Is that how this works? The authoritarian rolls and gains and then the liberal loses. I think there's a typo here. I think the authoritarian will lose the extra pieces. I'm not even going to look that up. That seems pretty obvious. And then the liberals get Constantinople and Italy. If both sides lost the Great War, you only do the first bullet point in the 2 paragraphs. You don't have any winners. The order, and it's basically indicating a dissolution of the current order, for whatever that matters. I'm not sure what that represents, but because it's like, okay, there's no ideology. They're kind of just first staying even. The order in which regions are scored is determined by the Great War winner. If both sides lost, the Entente gets to choose the first region affected, then the players alternate choosing. That could be important if you're running off the edge of the thing. Okay. I need to pause to let my battery charge up. I'm only having one camera, one battery, are impacting me in ways I wasn't expecting. I'm not really set up to be on a cord, and I hated it with this camera. I really hated it. It was bad enough with the others. But, I mean, I could turn things around and I could do it, but it had a good effect, which is I more wanted to play. It had a bad, it still didn't help though, because, you know, you sit me down in front of a video game and I just can't break away. So anyway, let's get to the last couple of pages of rules. There's not a lot left. First of all, the optional rule, and I want to try doing this. Instead of executing steps 8.42, 8.43, which is this redistribution by who won the war, instead, we're going to use these special mobilization cards. So this is a mini game. And what is this? If Russia is a participant, the Ottoman Empire will participate in the war on the opposite side. If the Triple Alliance or perfidious Italy is in effect, Italy is either Central Powers or Entente. Otherwise, they're not. Each player will be picking a mobilization card for each nation in the war on their side. And the cards will be revealed in order of ascending priority. Let's take a look at these suckers. Each nation has its own deck, and they have a number on them. You have to reveal the 0 first, etc. And you execute all valid mobilization effects, checking for the validity at the time of execution. It can become invalid by a different card with a lower priority. They're executed simultaneously, and then we go to final scoring. So there's 2 different ways to end the game, either with this little card play thing, which I think is cool and I want to look at. I'll actually probably I don't know. I'm not sure I can reset the state and see how the 2 different victory sets work. Score all the regions that participated in the Great War as if they were scoring rounds, and end the game determining a winner based on whose side the victory point marker's on. If it ends up tied, whoever won the Great War wins. If it's still a tie, everybody loses. Okay. Stability. Whenever a scoring card is played, there's something called a stability check that'll be done. Excuse me. Now, you must play a scoring card if you have it in your hand, unless you sink it in the ocean or discard it. A stability check is result. Now, I don't think you could. No, probably unless it's discarded. I bet you can't. I bet you they don't have points on them. Because I was going to say, I don't think you have any option to fire them into space in Twilight Struggle, but I don't think you have an option, excuse me, here to throw them in the ocean either. Stability check is done as follows. Each player will be choosing a stability card from here based on whatever the little effects are on that card. You might be able to choose more than one card. If you only have one card remaining, you get the rest of the deck. Now, this may be the same mechanism used in 1989, because I know he pays some tribute to 1989 in his designer notes. Then you play the cards, the non-active player first revealing and executing, then the active player reveals his. If either player selected more than one, they take turns playing them until all selected cards have been played. That's not a clearly written sentence, but I believe they alternate. That's what the take turns probably means. Once a stability, it may just be me not. Once a stability card has been played, it is unavailable for use until that player, because it says take turns playing until all selected cards have been played. Well, do you take your turn playing until all selected cards have been played, or do you alternate taking turns? You see what I... Once a stability card has been played, it's unavailable until you run down to one stability card, in which case you get another hand, or if the U.S. intervenes. Then the country will actually be scored, with the VP marker moving accordingly, and then you make your crisis roll to see if the war starts. Okay, so you make scoring checks during the last step of a stability check in a region on a scoring card, during final scoring for all regions, and during the Great War for all participating regions. I don't remember that. Yeah, I don't know what they're talking about. I think 2 and 3 are the same thing, and I don't see it. Do you score the Great War? Whenever you make a crisis, you fire, determine the participants. I don't see any scoring happening there. Yeah, I'm not sure about this this third one. Let's keep going. Maybe if the war doesn't happen. So there's the deal. Okay. Final scoring is either all regions if there's no war, or participating regions only if there is a war, which is interesting because if you don't drag someone into the war, they don't count anymore. Very interesting. Okay. So this is actually an or between 2 and 3. All right. The scoring cards, an ideology has a presence in a region if it controls this. So the scoring cards are divided into 3 things. I think Twilight Struggle had this. It reminds me most of History of the World. Presence, domination, and control. You have presence if you control a space in the region. You dominate the region if you control more spaces in the region than the opponent and more battleground spaces. Remember the split color ones I told you are more important in that region than the opponent. You must have at least one non-battleground and one battleground region in order to be dominating. You go to control if you have more spaces in the region than your opponent and all the battleground spaces. So you've gotten the key factors here. And the key factors, for example, in France are not physical locations except for Paris. In Germany, there's a couple of physical locations. In Austria, it looks like it's pure domination. Oh, this is interesting. They have the scoring values for each country. So you end up, hey, certain countries are more important than others, and in particular, Austria is not important. I guess that's what it comes down to. Everyone else looks like they're 369, and that's actually pretty helpful. You also will get an additional VP for each battleground space that you control in the region, and a VP for each independent country you control that's adjacent to the region, which makes these guys kind of interesting. You know, something like Switzerland is worth a point for France, Germany, and Austria. Of course, there isn't a lot of borderland between anybody and Russia. Sweden, I guess. And I guess when Sweden owns Norway, well, no, they're all connected to Kiel. Anyway, okay. Whatever. I had a thought. And you total them up, and then the difference between those is recorded on the track. You can't run off the track during the totaling. Certain event cards can cause victory points to just be scored. Whenever the track goes... Okay, so reaching the negative 20 or positive 20. God, I hate the way that's written. It's serpentine. It confuses me. I think Twilight Struggle was too. One of the few objections I have to that game. Yeah. So it's just a scoring track. Nothing exciting there. So there are a couple of ways to get an automatic victory. If you reach 20 victory points, you win instantaneously. However, a given event or scoring card is taken as an atomic action, no matter what. If the liberal player ends up gaining control of Germany and a German scoring card is played, they win. When the Great War happens, the game is over, and that can cause a win. If somebody cheats, holding a scoring card at the end of the turn, and you can show these, you can just show the top of the card to indicate that it's not a scoring card, then they lost. Now, I think Twilight Struggle only has, I think they have the similar rule, but you don't actually have to show it. That's only for tournament play that you have to, if I recall correctly. You can trust people not to. But maybe too many times people unintentionally made the mistake that the designer here said, look, let's just put it in the rules. If neither side has achieved a victory at the end of turn 10, every region is scored as if its card had just been played. No stability checks are conducted or crisis rolls. Every region's score must be calculated. And that's one atomic event. So is the Great War scoring. Once all regions have been scored, victory goes to the player who has accrued the most victory points. If the victory point marker is on a positive number, the liberal wins. If it's negative, the authoritarian wins. If it's on zero, it ends as a draw. And I seem to remember somewhere that German victory can happen automatically with end-of-game scoring as well. So I would have to look that up if that's the case. If the Liberals are... I probably will have to look that up before it's the case. But if the Liberals end up in control of Germany at the end of the game, I think they pull a victory. So anyway, that's the rule set. I'm a little excited to play it. I'm a little worried about... I mean, I love my World War I stuff. Twilight Struggle's a fun game. There's no question about that. I like the way it represents things, but I'm a little worried about this representation on this kind of... First of all, I don't really like the ideological bent of it as opposed to the national bent. It's just harder for me to see these things, although I have to say, and I'm not sure I buy his argument that, you know, you can break things down into two ideologies very cleanly, and he actually argues that, well, you know, you could make this like a 6-player game or something. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Five players probably is sufficient, but You can break this down into a certain number of world powers. So I think he's saying 6 or 7. I don't know which ones he's talking about there. Probably the U.S. and Turkey, maybe. Turkey and Italy. Take the diplomacy version. I have no idea, but you could break it down into that kind of setup, and then say, okay, well, there's still so many separate factions. Well, there's so many separate factions within the ideologies as well that making a clean break. Clearly, you couldn't do this as a national interest game on as a 2-player game, but there's as much blurring between the 2 ideologies as there would be, say, if you took the national interests of 7 different countries and then said, well, what about this? What about these factions within the countries, etc.? There's also a centrist type of version that you could certainly add to the mechanism. But the point is, the designer wanted to create something that's like Twilight Struggle, that's got that bipolar situation. And it's not an unreasonable choice. It's just, it makes me feel a little like, I feel like there are more ideologies that I'd want to explore, and it was something I was excited about the game ideology, a Euro-ish type game. In concept, it just, it didn't do it the way this looks like it's going to try. And then the other thing is that kind of iffy idea of areas that are, more political or social in nature than physical areas. I actually kind of like that. But what I'm iffy about there is the representation. It makes sense, though. Colonials are next to these. We've got, Paris is directly connected to everything, actually. But then, the church being sort of sitting between the army and the writers, and it gives me a feel kind of like the kind of maps that you have for things like Canadian Civil War, where, except that things are explicit on here. It would really be, I think, disappointing to see one where it didn't have names to the things and it didn't really link them. And the socioeconomic, they're going to fit in with the event cards and everything. I really like that. So let's give it a shot and see how it works. Of course, I have to load this up and go to work, or soon. It's still dark.